When I first got on the road this morning coming up here before the sun came up, I went past Sunset Park and I turned onto the highway. And I'm not sure if you've seen it, but the Lions Club put out a wooden nativity set that, if I remember right, they actually individually hand-built and cut. And it's lit up so beautifully at night. And to see that surrounded by snow this morning, talk about a portrait of Christmas that we think about. Last week we opened with looking at pictures of people's families. We saw the cute video of Brantley singing "I Want a Hippopotamus for Christmas." We talked about Joseph and about how somebody who's not really known super well in the Bible, how God used him in his faithfulness. This morning we're going to be looking at God's perfect timing in the Christmas story. And as I was thinking about this the past couple of months of, with everything crazy going on right now, that God's timing is perfect. Nothing surprises him. Nothing is out of his control. Even when to us it might seem that way. But if you have your Bibles this morning, we're going to be in Luke chapter 2. Starting in verse 1 through 7. Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house in the lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. We read that at this time of the year, and we think, I know that story pretty well. If you watch Charlie Brown Christmas, it's even in there when they're talking about the true meaning of Christmas. But when that decree went out, it was in God's perfect timing. That you can only imagine when Joseph came to Mary and said, "Hey, we got to travel about 100 miles by donkey, and you're 9 months pregnant, and we don't have a choice in this matter." Ladies, if you've been pregnant, how many of you like to travel in a car ride for 100 miles, let alone think about riding on a donkey for 100 miles? Everybody's like, But to think that that was even in God's perfect plan. That when Caesar Augustus sent out a decree to the people of the entire Roman Empire, that was part of God's plan to get two people where they needed to be. God moved millions of people within the Roman Empire to get two people where they needed to be. When I first thought about that, I went, pew. Because they had to be in Bethlehem to fulfill the prophecy of the prophets. That everything about this Christmas story was not coincidental. That for everything to fall into place as God had told the people through his prophets was no coincidence. It was his purpose and his providence that moved Mary and David. Because in the Old Testament, "O you Bethlehem," to think that Bethlehem would be great among the nation. Because like Nazareth, Bethlehem wasn't a huge town. It wasn't Jerusalem. When you think about where a king should be born, we think in a palace. If you've ever seen how most churches used to have children's musicals back in the day, back in the 90s, the early 2000s. Every church that had one, almost one theme that was in there, but shouldn't a king be born in a palace? And the answer is no. If you actually think about where Jesus was born, and what I love about living here is that y'all understand what it means to be born in a stall around cows, around what cows leave behind them. It wasn't pretty. It was smelly. But that would be in God's perfect plan. If you would leave your finger there and turn to Galatians chapter 4. Galatians 4, chapter 4. Chapter 4, starting in verse 4. But when the fullness of time had come. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoptions as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. That first little clause of this, but when the fullness of time had come, means more than we initially think. That so many times as we're looking at the picture of even what Paul's trying to get through in Galatians, that we so quickly gloss over this phrase, the fullness of time. Because for the Hebrew people, that their idea of a Messiah, that they were looking for a physical deliverer. And if we actually look in the timeline of the people of Israel, let's take a look at the screen. You can see the new Babylonian Empire. You see the different kingdoms broken out. This is after Babylon took over Israel. But even then, that's still not that big of an area. Here's the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire took over all those other empires. Here's the Greek Empire. Took over all that and then some. And you might be thinking, okay, why is this important? We're about to get there. But I want us to think about this, that from when God finally got tired of the people of Israel's sin, that he let them be captured and into captivity, they were captured and taken over by every single empire leading to Jesus. Here's the Roman Empire. Spanned the majority of the known world at the time. You can see all the roads, the main roads. You can see the shipping routes in the Mediterranean Sea. That at this point, the world was the most connected it would ever be united under one empire, ever in modern history. And it's no coincidence that this was the time when God decided to send his Son. For if you've taken world history years ago, back in high school, or if you ever took it in college, the saying that all roads lead to Rome. All of the modern world was connected. Even over to the side, on the far right, in the middle, those two roads that connect, those would head all the way into India and all the way towards China. That the entire part of the Eastern world was completely connected at that point. This was the time that God would choose to send his Messiah, to send his Son. Why? Because it wasn't just all about the birth, but it was about the crucifixion and the resurrection, so that the gospel news could go to all the world. I mean, it'd be great if the gospel went out throughout all Babylon and that was it. Because these kingdoms throughout the time were warring, and you couldn't cross from kingdom to kingdom without them thinking that you were a spy. But compared to when the world was connected, and here's even the crazier part, that these roads, that all roads lead to Rome, that were built as military roads for Rome to keep control of their empire. That what was meant for war would eventually be what the Prince of Peace would use to spread the eternal peace that Jesus had come to save. Because the world was the most connected it had ever been. You might be thinking, okay, how does this work? The Apostle Andrew was able to go to Greece. James, the brother of John, supposedly went all the way over to Spain. Bartholomew went to Turkey. Thomas, who we know is Doubting Thomas, the one who said that not until I see the nail-pierced hands of the Savior will I believe, he went all the way down to India. Simon and Jude went to Babylon. And Matthias was able to go all the way to Armenia. But the one that we know the best, the Apostle Paul, was able to travel all over that map. Most people think that the Apostle Paul, when he was writing the book of Romans to the Romans, was that he was trying to get funding because he wanted to go all the way over to Spain, and that he would share the gospel all along the way so that he could go all the way to what was known as the modern world. But God had other plans for Paul. Because this Christmas story that we have, this Christmas narrative, this Christmas promise, this Christmas fulfillment, fulfills hundreds of prophecies about the Messiah. That what we now know is zero on the timeline. Timeline was put together later. But that's when God would send his son. That it was no coincidence, because Jesus had to fulfill promise after promise. That he would fulfill prophecy after prophecy. And all this happened because God's timing is perfect. So this good news that we have, this good news that we carry, we are more connected now than even Rome was. Most of us have people in our social media circles who live thousands of miles away. I was thinking, if Jesus came today, you know what it would probably get labeled as on Facebook and Twitter? There'd probably be some fact-checking things saying, this is partially false. Or that this can't be proven. But the amount of connectivity that we have to share Jesus is unimaginable by biblical standards. That this amount of connectivity that we have is really crazy. But how these disciples had to travel thousands of miles to share Jesus, that you and I are just one click away nowadays from doing it. That not just saying Merry Christmas, but Merry Christmas, do you know the one who Christmas is about? And I'm literally preaching to the choir this morning, because who else would get out when it's snowing outside and there's snowdrifts in the parking lot? But that you and I have a story to share, that Jesus has come for you and for me. And throughout this Christmas season, may we always remember that God's timing is perfect. That as the world is still spinning a little bit crazy, that nothing is by coincidence. 2020 didn't surprise God. It surprised all of us. But what is amazing is how many people have heard the good news about Jesus. That while many church buildings around the United States got shut down for a while, that their influence only grew through the modern roads of technology. New estimates say that tens of thousands of people were introduced to Jesus because of this. That while the church buildings may have been shut down, that the church itself didn't. And that the good news goes out day after day after day. And it wasn't just because the churches went to Facebook Live and YouTube Live, but it's because everyday Christians shared their story with their friends, with their families, that Jesus saves. And I don't think I can ever say this enough, but now is the season to share, because now is when people are paying attention the most. Because even if Christmas for most people is just about giving gifts and getting gifts, that we can all share about the greatest gift of all.